In 2010, Pete came across my website. It resonated with him because of his own story. He said, "Here's my video, take a good look." And I did. And his video and his story really represents the expert opinions throughout the world in every field. And we really need to become more creative with the tools we have, with the knowledge we have, rather than just apply the tools mechanically as a system. So here he is.
I just finished the South African military service when a friend of mine who I'd met in the army asked me to travel with him to his privately owned game reserve to film some newly born lion cubs. This obviously was a great opportunity and a wonderful environment to go to. So very enthusiastically I drove up to this farm called Mabula Lodge, which was about 4 or 5 hours north of Johannesburg. We saw giraffe, we saw rhino, we saw antelope. It was a spectacular day and I was getting fabulous photographs. In the afternoon, this was the highlight of the day, we were going to film the lion cubs. So my girlfriend and I and Willie Joubert, a big, huge South African farmer, the three of us got into an open Land Rover and we drove off to where these lions were. I couldn't wait to see them. I jumped out of the car and immediately started filming 3 small lion cubs. They were so cuddly and cute and they looked so really harmless. They looked like toys, really. And I was being quite careful not to get too close to them. When you're a cameraman and you look through the viewfinder of a camera, you're not really aware of what's around you that much, but you're focusing and making sure that you're getting the very, very best pictures. Well, suddenly, without any warning whatsoever, bang! I felt this extraordinary power hit me on my right hand. The camera went flying and my arm was pulled to one side and crunch! I looked and I couldn't believe it. A lioness right on the end of my arm. And her teeth, her first tooth went right through my arm there, bit this finger over here clean off, and her teeth went through that knuckle and broke the hand like a V. And as she was hanging on to my hand, munching it away, all I could hear was my bones crunching and cracking, and the pain was extraordinary, a lot of pain. So by the time I actually got to the hospital, my whole feeling was here at last. They rushed me into theatre. The anaesthetist put a drip up, gave me my pre-med, and the surgeon arrived. He was late for a bit. He arrived in there and he looked at my hand and started to take the bandage off this hand. But he didn't put any saline water on or anything and just started ripping it off. And as you can imagine, all the nerve endings were exposed and it was incredibly painful. And I was perhaps slightly rude and I said to him, "Cool it, chappie, it's really painful." At which point he said, "Who's your chappie? I'm doctor." And then I thought, whoops, we're in trouble here. He got it off and looked at my hand and informed me he was going to amputate my hand. And I said, "I beg your pardon?" He said, "I'm going to amputate your hand 2 inches above the wrist." As a young 21-year-old cameraman, the idea of having no hand, let alone for anybody, but the fact that I needed my hand for my job, this was the worst news you could imagine. At first, I politely said to him, "Do you think it's necessary?" He informed me he had been a doctor for 26 years. He knew what he was talking about. There was a multiple crush injury. Infection had already set in, gangrene had set in. And in order to save my arm, absolutely had to chop my hand off, throw it away. I said, "What? Is there anybody else that we could talk to? Could we have a second opinion? This is pretty radical." He said, "I know what I'm talking about. I'm a doctor. I've been a doctor for 26 years. I'm going to chop your hand off. And don't worry, you can go home in 2 or 3 days. You'll be fine." He told me he was the only doctor in the hospital and his opinion was the right one and I could take it or leave it. So at which point I said, "Well, I'm leaving." And I pulled the drip out of my arm, jumped off the table and left the operating theatre with my bottom hanging out of my theatre gown. I walked down the corridor and I met the nurse behind the desk at reception and asked her if I could use the phone so I could call my parents in Johannesburg to let them know what had happened. To my surprise, she wouldn't let me use the phone. So there I went to the call box with my hand dripping blood all over the floor and no money and no support, when a very pleasant nurse came along and put a few coins in the call box and I managed to phone my parents. Luckily for me, my brother happened to be there and he answered the phone, and at the sound of his voice I just burst into tears. I couldn't believe that somebody I could relate to would understand what I was going through, and I said, "Stuart, I've been eaten by a lion." And he was fantastic. Within an hour he had a private ambulance waiting for me. His girlfriend, who worked as a nurse, had organised the best doctors in the country to be waiting for me on arrival in Johannesburg. So about an hour and a half later I arrived at the Johannesburg General. There were 17 doctors waiting for me. The reason there were 17, it was a training hospital, and the professor of microsurgery had asked his entire fifth-year medical class to come out on a Sunday night to witness the repairing of a lion attack victim. Clearly, if it had been a motorbike accident, I wouldn't have had perhaps the same amount of attention. But I was whisked into theatre, having first an x-ray, which was good because the other people hadn't even bothered to do an x-ray, and then straight into the operating theatre. You can imagine 8 hours later when I woke. For that whole period I couldn't use my right hand, so I learned to use my left hand. I played table tennis, learned how to shave, and became left-handed. Wrote thank you letters left-handed. And on one of my weekends out, I went and played football, and to my amazement, I kicked the ball left-footed. And then I started to think I'd actually become left-handed. I then realized that I'd become more creative, more understanding, more considerate, and my brain had shifted a little bit as a result of this accident. And the message really is for all of us in life. Things do happen that are unexpected, but you have the power of choice. And if I'd just taken that doctor's first opinion, today I would have been leading a very, very different life. I would have had one hand instead of two. And because I was able to ask for a second opinion and look for further professional advice, luckily for me, I made the right decision.
The moral of the story is there's also always another way, especially if it's totally unconventional. Like Jim Rohn says, look at what 97% of the people are doing and run the other way. And this is what I do, and I encourage you to do that.